In this video, I would like to present you two Russian attacks happened in largely the same time. The first one was an offensive slowly grinding forward, going on largely unnoticed, while the other was a spectacular armored push gaining a lots of attention but far less results. I would use these two attacks to present the circumstances of the transparent battlefield and how military success is achievable under these conditions. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. And now, let's start. The first attack, which is slightly overlooked, happened in the northern section of the front. Near Dvorichnya, the Russian bridgeheads require another video in their own, therefore I will disregard them now and concentrate our focus a bit south. The main terrain features of this section of the front are the Oskil River and its crossing points near Kupiansk, Barova and Oskil, the Zherebets River and the Zherebranki Forest, and the Siversky Donets River. Of course, between these rivers, smaller creeks and their valleys, tree lines and urban areas make the terrain even more difficult to pass. In the north, since early December, the Russians concentrate their resources on creating sustainable bridgeheads over the Oskil River north of Kupiansk, thus trapping the Ukrainians fighting on the eastern bank of the river. South from the Russian wedge near Pishanye, the Russians also intended to trap a large Ukrainian force on the eastern bank. In order to do so, option number 1 would be to attack directly towards south, parallel with the Oskil River, and trap the whole Ukrainian bridgehead. This option is not feasible because of two reasons. Reason number 1 is that in the age of transparent battlefield, and in the event of near-peer warring parties, it is simply impossible to execute an armored breakthrough of this size. Reason number 2 is that it is impossible to concentrate enough personnel and equipment necessary for a breakthrough in an area this small. Option number 2 would be to execute option number 1, but in a smaller scale, attack from the north towards Liman. However, it is also a pretty difficult task considering the fact that one of the toughest Ukrainian military units, the 3rd Assault Brigade, is defending this area. Option number 3 would be an attack towards Liman from the east, but it would mean to quickly capture the Zherebranki forest, which is impossible knowing the last 28 months of brutal combat happening there. Now we can see that the complete encirclement of the whole Ukrainian grouping is not possible. The other option for the Russians is to cut the Ukrainians into further, smaller quadrants and subsequently destroy them one by one. In this regard, their only option was to attack near Terny around the dams on the reservoir in the Zherebets River. It is also a difficult task to execute, but this is the best location to penetrate the Ukrainian lines. Let's see why. The Zherebets is not a huge river, but it is wide enough that pontoon or assault bridges have to be laid over it. The other option, of course, is to cross it by rubber boats. Well, if the attacker does not favor any of these options, there is a third, but it is a pretty difficult one. There are 3 dams at the reservoir marked as Objective Alpha, Bravo and Charlie respectively. It is interesting to note that at the beginning of the battle, middle of November, the Ukrainians had 2 brigades and a separate battalion holding the line, while the Russians had the 144th Guards Motorized Rifle Division as the formation responsible for the offensive, with its 3 regiments under its command in the future axis of attack. Here, please allow me a personal note. Some years ago, when I was an instructor at an MDMP course, we have executed lots of staff exercises during which we used made-up but realistic scenarios. In these scenarios, the evil enemy was the dreadful Red Country, of course. In order to have a realistic scenario, I had to create Red Country units somewhat realistic, so I chose the Russian 144th Guards Motorized Rifle Division as an enemy formation for these exercises, and spent weeks to study this unit, its structure and equipment. Thus the Russian units mentioned in the coming minutes are particularly weirdly dear friends. Not so much, of course, as for the Ukrainians who fought heroically against them. In my previous slide, I mentioned the middle of November as the beginning of the battle. However, the first Russian attacks in the direction of Terny started late December. This gap in time is no surprise. I wanted to show you that the Ukrainians had time to plan and prepare to counter the most dangerous Russian direction of attack. However, there was one big caveat on the Ukrainian side. While the Russians had one formation, the aforementioned 144th Division, responsible for the coordination of the offensives, the Ukrainians did not have an organization with the same function. They had just units next to each other fighting with low level of coordination. On the 26th of December, the Russians executed a surprise attack. After a short but heavy artillery preparation, they managed to push through the dam marked as Objective Alpha and grab a foothold at the western bank. This seems to be a simple thing, but let's examine it a bit more detailed. Deducted from open sources, the unit executing this attack was the 1428th Motorized Rifle Regiment. The Russian 1000 series regiments are new units, which structure had been tailored to execute the infantry assault group tactic. It means that they can employ very effective artillery and drone preparations because they have attack drone and artillery units at all levels. It also means that they have a flexible, thus effective kill chain. Well, an organization with a structure tailored to its employment and employed correctly achieves success. What a surprise! This bridgehead instantly became the target of powerful Ukrainian drone and artillery strikes. However, it seems that these strikes were not powerful enough, but this was not even the real problem. The real problem was that the Ukrainians did not launch any counterattacks. However, this bridgehead was very exposed. They could have counterattacked it from the front, or what is even better, they could have flanked it from behind, but neither of it happened. According to both Russian and Ukrainian sources, the main reason of the total lack of counterattacks was that there were no available infantry reserves in this section of the front at that time. 3 days after the Russian tactical success at Objective Alpha, it was clear that the Ukrainians are unable to push back the Russians. But it was also clear that the bridgehead is still exposed. This success seemingly was a surprise for both warring parties, because the Russians were unable to launch a supporting attack of their previous success just after 2 days of plan and prepare. But after these 2 days, the attack was a total success. On the 29th of December, the 1428th Motorized Rifle Regiment, in close coordination with the 488th Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, launched an attack and captured the gentle hill north and northeast of Terny, thus securing their bridgehead at Objective Alpha. After their success on the 29th, the Russians continued to work strictly according to their schedule. On the 31st, they attacked against Terny, but this attack has been beaten back in brutal hand-to-hand combat. After another 2 days of plan and preparation, they launched another attack which proved to be more successful. There was, and still is, another dam south of Objective Alpha, right east of the small village of Ivanivka. The Russians managed to push the Ukrainians back a few houses in Terny, and in close coordination with this operation, they pushed through the dam and captured another foothold. After 24 hours of bitter combat, the Russians managed to unify their bridgeheads at Ivanivka, and by the 4th of January they set their foot on the hill overlooking their bridgehead. Here I have to stop for a minute because an interesting tactical element could be observed. As I mentioned before, the Ukrainians were suffering because of the lack of available infantry, but counterattacks had to be made, therefore they attacked what they had at hand. The 60th Mechanized Infantry Brigade sent a pair of T-72 tanks with the cover of drones against the Russians in Ivanivka. It is a well-known rule that tanks should always be supported by infantry, but in this case there were no such available subunits, it seems not even a squad. The drones were employed with high proficiency and in rows mutually supporting each other and the tank. First, recon drones flew in order to gain and maintain a continuous and accurate situational awareness. Then, bomber drones came in order to drop grenades on targets such as Russian RPG operators or ordinary soldiers. These bomber drones were escorted by FPV drones, which's task was to deter the Russian soldiers trying to shoot down the big and slow-moving bombers. Subsequently, the two tanks came with FPV drones at close support and shot up everything that they found. But the Ukrainian tanks had to retreat because in nowadays battlefield, sooner or later they would have been effectively targeted by Russian drones. And without infantry, the achieved success could not be long-lasting, therefore this counterattack may have caused serious problems for the Russians, but at the end of the day it did not change anything important. The Russians firmly had the bridgehead at Ivanivka, therefore they successfully executed the first step of a decisive attack, the penetration. It was time to go for a breakthrough. The Russians stick to their schedule. On the 6th of January, they managed to advance up another important hill northwest of their bridgehead, and by doing so, they forced the Ukrainians out from a river bend south of it. With this success, the Russians took a large step to execute a real breakthrough. However, the Ukrainians did not just sit and wait. They continuously tried to gather reinforcements and hastily dispatch them to this sector. And of course, drone and artillery strikes were also constant against the Russians' bridgehead. This, and the fact that everything had to be sent through the two very tiny choke points, the two dams, slowed down the Russian schedule, and they needed not 2 but 4 days for their next success. On the 10th of January, the Russians advanced 2 kilometers deep and 1 kilometer wide along the road to the village of Kalodyazi. With this success, they forced the Ukrainian defenders of Objective Bravo to fall back. And what they also achieved, that their bridgehead could not be destroyed with a single attack, but it required the concentrated effort of at least a whole brigade. This means that the Russians achieved a breakthrough. It was time for the exploitation. Normally, an exploitation happens in 12 to 36 hours, but since sensors saturating the battlefield, large and fast maneuvers of this kind are virtually impossible to execute. Therefore, it is no surprise that the Russians employed their already well-functioning and battle-proven tactics, the balance-shifting attack method combined with the infantry assault group tactics. The Russians had the bridgehead large enough to hide adequate forces to launch significant, even company-sized attacks. After the success of the 10th of January, it took the Russians a week to adequately reconnoiter the possible axis of attacks and to gather enough forces to continue the offensive. Of course, in the meantime, the Ukrainians constantly sent reinforcements into this sector, however, these forces were only dripping slowly. Just think about it. This time, mid-January, the Kursk salient was still a hot sector, and the battle for Velika Novosilka was raging on. Furthermore, in this exact time, the Pokrovsk and Andriivka sectors were also a scene of intense battles. Therefore, the Ukrainians did not have significant reinforcements available. So the Russians had the time what was necessary, and on the 19th they attacked with the full force. On the 19th of January, they managed to concentrate that large force into the bridgehead that they could execute 2 successful company-sized attacks in the same time. On the south, they advanced towards the streambed northeast of Kalodyazi, while on the west, they managed to advance in another streambed and reached an important plateau overlooking the whole bridgehead. Because of the strengthening Ukrainian defenses and the choke point behind them, the Russians required another 2 weeks to capture the Ukrainian defensive positions between their two previous successes, but by the 2nd of February they captured the whole hillside. Despite these successes, the Russians did, or it is more accurate, could not advance further. It is because that the Ukrainian reserves were arriving. For example, by the 2nd of February, the whole 33rd Assault Brigade was operating in this area. The other reason is that the Russians still had to send everything into the bridgehead via these two narrow dams, which are a serious choke point in regard of operational tempo. These choke points could have been under serious threat in the event of Ukrainians strengthened their drone and artillery presence near Terny. This threat must have been eliminated before the Russians could advance further west, facing the ever-strengthening Ukrainian resistance. The Russians acted accordingly, and while the 144th Guard Motorized Rifle Division made the 1428th Motorized Rifle Regiment to focus west, the division sent the 488th Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment to attack south along a wide front. After week-long meticulous artillery, drone and electronic warfare preparations, the 488th Guard Motorized Rifle Regiment launched the attack. The Ukrainian 63rd Mechanized Infantry Brigade tried to do its best, but the fire preparation made its presence felt, and after a day-long brutal combat the Russians captured the ruined village of Terny and, what is most important, the forested hill east of it. And on the 11th, they managed to capture another ruined village near the water reservoir, Yampolivka. Interestingly, mid-process, the Russian exploitation stopped for the rest of February. From the point of view of logical structure of an offensive, it has only one reason. The Russians could not advance further. They still had now not two, but three dams to supply the bridgehead west of the Zherebets River, but it proved to be inadequate. It is proven by the fact that the Ukrainians could still execute deadly strike on the choke points. A source that I will not show, but it is in the description, presents 23 dead Russians after such an event at the dam near Ivanyivka. All of this resulted that the Russians could achieve their next success only on the 2nd of March, when they advanced a bit on the plateau. The situation reached a stalemate. The Russians could not advance further, while the Ukrainians could not destroy the Russian bridgehead. In order to retain the initiative, one of the sides had to attack. The Russians had the superiority in numbers to do so. They shifted their balance again, and on the 15th of March they crossed the Zherebets River on rubber boats up north near the village of Nevske. Here they met with heavy resistance of the Ukrainian 19th Separate Infantry Battalion, but after sending one infantry group after another, they managed to climb from the riverbed and grab a toehold on the hill overlooking the crossing point. This new Russian bridgehead created a new situation, because until this it seemed that the Ukrainians had somehow managed to contain the Russian exploitation, but it turned out that the Russians successfully maneuvered themselves out from the forming stalemate. A spectacular example for that happened on the 21st of March. On this day, the Russians executed two parallel attacks, both with an assault company each. On the northern axis, they captured a tactically important forested hill overlooking their smaller bridgehead, while on the south, they captured the northern edge of the plateau and advanced towards the village of Nove. The Ukrainians quickly realized the seriousness of their situation between the two bridgeheads, and still on the 24th they have retreated from there, and by the morning of 26 the Russians cleared and captured that area, thus unifying their bridgehead. Still on the 26th, the Russians tried to push towards west and maintain the initiative by attacking in every third day. By doing so, on the 26th of March, they advanced a bit towards Nove and Katerinivka. These last two operations did not achieve that huge success, and it can have multiple reasons. One, that the Russians were in a hurry in order to maintain the initiative, therefore these attacks had been carried out without adequate plan and prepare. Option number two is that the Ukrainians constantly sent reinforcements and it had made its presence felt. I think that both options are true in the same time. The Russians, however, continued their attacks, but until the 28th of April, which is the data cut-off day of this video, they did not advance a lot. On the south, they reached Kalosgy. On the southwest, they reached the next stream bed, but towards northwest, their advance had been firmly stopped. Before we could go further with the analysis of another very interesting attack, I'd like to summarize the important features of this operation. The Russians thoroughly reconnoitered the weak spot in the Ukrainian defenses and concentrated a whole division there. The Ukrainian defenses here were understaffed and not fully prepared because of the low probability of an attack. It resulted in a surprise which largely helped the Russians. Nowadays, on the sensor-saturated battlefield, it is still a must to try to achieve a surprise. As I said, the Russians had a whole division to coordinate the attacks, while on the Ukrainian side at that time there were brigades and battalions fighting next to each other with a lower level of coordination. The Russians attacked according to a well-thought-out, strict schedule. When they had an easy access to the engagement area, so they could send reinforcements and supplies forward easily, they attacked on every third day, and each attack came on the perimeter of the area of interest of the previous one. When they had difficult access to the engagement area, they attacked not in every third, but on every 6th or 7th day. After these partial conclusions, let's examine the other attack what I was talking about in the introduction. Why I want to talk about this other operation is because it is totally different from anything that we have seen in the last 6 months. It was a surprise armored attack trying to rip through the Ukrainian lines at an unexpected location. To understand why the Russians tried this, let's have a closer look on the situation. The Russians' main axis of advance was Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar. The Pokrovsk direction had been firmly stopped, and the Ukrainians are executing effective counterattacks ever since. The Chasiv Yar direction is still a meat grinder. The 98th Guard Air Assault Division, responsible for the offensive there, suffers constantly, while it's slowly but surely grinding itself forward. But the fighting is still raging inside the town. The direction of Toretsk looks largely the blend of Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. It is a brutal urban battle going on since early summer of 2024. In this regard, it is very similar to the one in Chasiv Yar. However, the Ukrainians are constantly launching small but very effective counterattacks against the Russians, trying to contain their advance. In this regard, it is very similar to what is happening near Pokrovsk. But it is indeed very different, and in order to find out why, as always, we have to have a closer look on the terrain and the tactical situation there. When the battle have commenced in summer of 2024, the direction of Toretsk was very important because it was the only Russian bridgehead west of the Siversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. At this time, the Russians were advancing relatively rapidly near Acheretinye towards Pokrovsk, but in the direction of the northern part of the Donbass, I mean in the direction of Siversk and Slovyansk. The bridgehead at Toretsk was the starting point of the strategically important operational direction of attack. Toretsk was and still is a heavily fortified and very difficult to pass part of the Donbass front. In order to advance into the rear of both Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk operational directions, the Russians have to overcome a very difficult terrain. First and foremost, the built-up areas. There are also significant water obstacles further hampering the movement. Not surprisingly, along the small rivers and canals and waste heaps results of mining, terrain elevation also poses constraints on the maneuver. All of these terrain features result that the Russians had to break through the town of Toretsk itself and then attack into two directions trying to seize Konstantinivka. The Russians acted accordingly. Throughout the second half of 2024, they utilized their infantry assault group tactics and balance shifting attack method, both of course adopted to the needs of urban operations. The Ukrainians realized the importance of Toretsk and constantly sent reinforcements, with which they constantly launched counterattacks. However, after 10 months of brutal urban combat, the warring parties reached this situation. By the end of March 2025, Toretsk was practically captured by the Russians. However, the situation was a dynamic stalemate. The Russians attacked constantly, while the Ukrainians constantly ruined their timetable by counterattacks. This modus operandi resulted that both sides burned their resources at a high rate. However, it is also true that the Russians have more resources. The 8th Combined Arms Army had the 150th Motorized Rifle Division under its command, responsible for the advance on Toretsk. The 150th Motorized Rifle Division constantly received reinforcements, but the Russian commanders knew that these reinforcements will be burned also without reaching significant results. Therefore, they chose to try something that had not been seen here for more than a year: an armored breakthrough. In the first week of April, the Russians started the shaping operations for the armored assault. From the 2nd to the 8th of April, they intensified their artillery and drone attacks on the Ukrainian positions near the village of Kleban-Bik and battle positions west of it. While in the same time, the Russians also carried out infantry attacks around the village of Giliyivka, seemingly shifting the center of gravity of their attacks towards north and indeed achieving some success there. All of these events were going on for more than a week, and after this the Russians saw that it is time to strike. The 10th of April was the day of the decisive operation. After a short but heavy artillery preparation, the Russians commenced the main attack. They deployed a whole infantry assault company mounted on armored vehicles. This company-sized element had approximately 9 APCs or IFVs and 4 tanks. This reinforced mechanized infantry company attacked along the Toretsk-Konstantinivka road. Their goal, according to my deduction, was to capture the village of Pleshchivka, thus having an important objective under their control, and forcing the Ukrainians to reconcentrate their efforts trying to contain further Russian advances. They surprised the Ukrainians, it is without a doubt. Thanks to the effective artillery strikes and the initial high operational tempo, the Russians broke through the Ukrainian defenses. But what had happened after, it is even more interesting. After a breakthrough the first line of defense, the Russians didn't meet the second line of Ukrainian defense, and they did not even meet Ukrainian mechanized infantry counterattacks, but they met with a wall of drones. The last Russian BTR-82 reached up to the village of Pleshchivka, which is 8 kilometers behind the Ukrainian first line of O troops. But this APC got destroyed by drones, and this deployed infantry got mobbed up also by drones. Before this could have happened, the Russians lost all of their attacking vehicles along the road. The Russians' armored breakthrough attempt had been eliminated almost exclusively by drones, which is a clear proof of the poor electronic warfare support of this operation from the Russian side. Okay, so what we have learned from all of this? First and foremost, without adequate electronic warfare and other anti-drone support, all attacks are doomed. Because of the nature of electronic warfare support, it is extremely difficult to effectively counter drones in the event of a 4 to 8 kilometers deep or even deeper maneuver. It is because the whole maneuver of the attack has to be under an EV umbrella. This umbrella is very difficult to maintain if the onboard jammers of the vehicles are not working properly or the defender uses wire-guided FPV drones. It is also difficult to maintain if we consider that the other option is to create the jamming umbrella by long-range jamming systems well behind the assault departure line. Their jamming is practically an electronic emission, which can be tracked, and this way the jamming asset can and will be destroyed as top priority for the defenders, thus opening the way for their drones. Until reliable onboard jammers and reliable anti-drone air defense artillery not have been developed, the classic armored penetration is practically impossible to achieve if the defender has adequate drone capabilities. Then what is that is working? Well, this is the Russian attack method we have seen in the battle near Terny. Accurate and reliable reconnaissance in order to have a clear picture of the defenses. As a first step, the attacker's electronic warfare assets must reliably jam the defender's drones in order to prevent its reconnaissance drones and drone strikes. Naturally, it helps own artillery to carry out successful fire missions and to survive at least as long as they fulfill their task. This artillery and drone preparation goes on for at least 36 but rather 48 hours in order to soften the defenses around the assault objective. If the BDA, or if you like, battle damage assessment, is incorrect, or the artillery suffers casualties, this fire preparation can be inadequate. But now let's assume that the fire preparation goes well, so according to the schedule it is time for isolating the objective. Vehicles from the armor platoon of the assault company employ effective suppressive fire both on the objective and its adjacent positions. In close coordination with this, the infantry assault group assaults the objective and captures it. Well, this looks good on paper, but a lot of things can go wrong. Both warring parties employ well-prepared assaults of mechanized infantry subunits with relative success, because this is the only way to attack successfully in 2025 in the Russia-Ukraine war. And it is crystal clear that the overwhelming majority of attacks like this are executed by the Russians, and they have a problem unique to them. According to my research and battlefield reports, the Russians operate according to a strict timetable. They have an exact designated time for everything, such as electronic warfare preparation, indirect and direct fire preparation, executing the maneuvers both with the assault group and with fires. And all of this is executed according to a rigid timetable, something like we call synchronization matrix in the NATO. But the main difference that usually the Russians always stick to their schedule, therefore if something goes wrong, the assault is failed or cannot be executed at all. If the Ukrainians manage to preserve their drones or relocate some drone or artillery subunits, it can seriously hamper the fire preparation and the concentration of assault forces. If the preparatory phase has been disrupted, the whole process of attack can be set back with 24 or up to 72 hours. Of course, it can be combined with a counterattack. Attacking the forward Russian positions right before they could commence their operation also can seriously set back the Russian timetable. I hope that in this video I could present you the possibilities and circumstances of offensive operations. They were no easy things before the era of drones and transparent battlefield. But now, because observation and fires have enhanced capabilities, executing a successful maneuver requires a lot more precise and multi-layered preparation and security than ever before. Well, that is all that I wanted to say. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. Thank you and see you soon.